Let me tell you a story. A story about one of the most formative experiences of my young life. I'll set the scene. It's a warm, rainy summer's night, around 11 pm. I'm sat alone in my bedroom at approximately 11 years of age. The rest of the house is asleep, but I'm wide awake because in my hand is contraband material, something dangerous, something exciting. A DVD of a horror movie, The Blair Witch Project. I had never actually seen a horror movie before. My family had never really liked them, and my parents had never allowed me to watch any. But I managed to smuggle a copy of the movie home, stowed safely inside my rucksack after visiting a friend's house. And after patiently waiting for the rest of my family to fall asleep, the time had come to enter into this strange new world. I inserted the DVD into my PlayStation 2, positioned inches from the television screen, and pressed play. It's difficult to overstate just how much of a shock to my system seeing The Blair Witch Project was back then. I had seen a lot of movies, don't get me wrong, but the vast majority of them were glossy, big-budget action flicks that moved a mile a minute, animated films saturated with colour and energy, teen comedies where I really only understood about 50% of the jokes. I kept reaching for comparisons as I watched, something safe, something familiar, and I always came up short. I hadn't seen anything like this before, anything that moved, looked, sounded even close to this. When that ending hit and the credits rolled, I sat in silence, in awe, shaking in terror and yet utterly entranced by what it was I had just seen. I immediately decided that it was one of the best movies I had ever seen in my life, and that I had to have more like it. Anything like it. And thus began my steady descent into the world of the horror movie, begging my friends to bring back anything they had like it, scouring car boot sales and charity shops for cheap DVDs I could pick up with the fairly limited financial resources to my name, squinting at low quality VHS rips of obscure 70s and 80s slashers on YouTube. Anything to recapture that initial, immensely powerful feeling of, what is it that I've just witnessed? And why did I love it so much? I'm very much willing to bet that I'm not alone in this experience, that there are thousands, if not more people who got their start in horror just like this. The details may change, but that story seems universal. And for years, I've been unable to articulate why it is that I love the horror movie. When posed the question by well-meaning friends and relatives who simply don't understand the appeal of violence and terror as entertainment, I could only shrug my shoulders, my answer being a vague variation on, I don't know, they're just different to everything else. But now, a little older, a little wiser, I think that I have the answer. Put simply, I think it's because the horror understands us in such an intimate and vulnerable way that not many other genres or styles can replicate. As a genre, it's immensely effective at peeling back the layers of culture and society to expose the often quite frightening and disturbing underbelly. And whilst that experience can be confronting and challenging to a great many people, there's also a strong sense of comfort to be taken in a genre that never feels anything less than honest. Say what you will about the genre. Horror won't lie to you. It won't smooth over the edges of the disturbing and the unknown. Instead, it invites us to take a closer look at these issues, fixes the camera at them and asserting that we shouldn't look away. Let's take a look at this. Let's think about it and let's talk about it. Mental illness, nihilism, violence, voyeurism, insanity. Horror doesn't shy away from these potentially difficult topics in the way that the vast majority of culture and media tends to. It understands that even as life can be beautiful, it can also be very cruel. But that balance, that delicate balance, makes life and the horror movie what it is. I also think that part of what makes horror special as a genre is its capacity for risk. To contrast genuine human honesty and empathy with such dark and frightening subject matter is a substantial risk in of itself. But I would be remiss to ignore the fact that this risk spreads far beyond those particular confines, and it's part of what makes the genre so memorable. A great many of the greatest and most well-regarded horror films are founded upon these types of bold risks. They can be minor, as in Bob Clark's blending of Jarlow's stylistic elements with a structure that predates the American slasher in Black Christmas, or they can be major, as in Sam Raimi's reimagining of his cult hit The Evil Dead as a bizarro slapstick comedy more indebted to the Looney Tunes than to extreme cinema in Evil Dead 2. They can be very blatantly intertextual risks. Reanimator's appropriation of the iconic score from Hitchcock's Psycho comes to mind here. Or the risk can just be downright bizarre. A technological body horror nightmare that plays like a visual headache in Tetsuo the Iron Man. Risk is the connecting through line between each of these stone cold classics of the genre. That is not to say that every risk pays off all the time. You will probably have more bad horror movies than in any other genre of film. But that is fine by me. I would much rather a movie be bad than boring. There's an interesting quote regarding the musical achievements of most art that becomes oddly relevant in regard to this area. Only bad composers write chronically good music. An uninterrupted flow of immaculacy is the prerogative of mediocrity. If you don't say anything, there is not much chance of spoiling anything. When we turn this quote towards the horror movie, it becomes especially enlightening. Risk is the very lifeblood of art, it seems. To make something interesting, something memorable, something that will stand the test of time, there must be some risk involved. And horror, a genre that perplexes and alienates a great many people, has this idea of risk embedded into its very bones. But let's return to those elements of empathy and honesty. There's a great quote on the nature of fiction that I think is reasonably applicable here. In a wonderful book of essays entitled Art Objects, the author and poet Jeanette Winterson says that falling for a book, or in our case, a horror movie, is not the nymph Echo falling for the sound of her own voice, nor is it the boy Narcissus falling for his own reflection. Those Greek myths warn us of the dangers of recognizing no reality but our own. Art is a way into other realities, other personalities. And although I very much doubt she was referring to the transcendent artistic powers of a film like The Toxic Avenger, her words are fascinating in the context of this horror and its inherent capacity for empathy. Very few other genres invite us to come so close to the darkness and the evil that we naturally spend our lives avoiding. Little else allows us to get so intimately inside the minds of a murder victim, the mentally ill, the paranoid, the damned, and sometimes even the murderer themselves. I believe that the importance and the power of art, all art, is that it enables us to not only better comprehend the world around us, but to better comprehend ourselves. If we look at horror protagonists that have endured throughout the years, I think that they captivate us simply because we can see a little bit of ourselves in them. There's an interesting article by the writer and filmmaker James Reinhardt that explores this idea of empathy and connection to the horror protagonist a little further. He writes, by asking an audience to root for a character's demise, a film forgoes one of the basic tenets of horror, which is empathy. We get scared because we formed an attachment to a character that we want to see make it through a horror film, not because we want to see that character punished. Characters like Laurie Strode in Halloween or Ellen Ripley in Alien endure because the audience has grown to like them and root for them to make it to the end credits in one piece. A film isn't scary if it wants its audience to root for bad things to happen, and audiences don't get invested if a film is asking them not to care about what happens to the characters. It's a good read, even if it has a little too much Jason Takes Manhattan bashing for my liking, and I'll link it down in the description. Hell, horror can sometimes go so far as to make the antagonists themselves vaguely empathetic and understandable. Nobody is going to argue that Jason Voorhees, for example, is a kind, well-mannered gentleman, but he is written and designed in such a way that there is a spark of empathy there. He's the outsider pushed too far, the bullied loner trapped in a state of arrested development who lashes out against the world. This doesn't make him in any way not a monster, but it's a small concentrated burst of cinematic magic that he is in any way understandable as anything beyond a ruthless killer. And that's to say absolutely nothing of characters who straddle that line between victim and villain. Stephen King's own Carrie White is a phenomenal example of this, and it's the film's capacity for empathy and honesty with that central character, even when she is doing horrible, horrible things, that ensures it's one of my favourite horror films of all time. We connect to these characters, even when we really probably shouldn't, because of the empathy and sincerity with which their stories are told. And the very best of these stories should remind us of exactly why they are told, why they are remembered and are passed down. Occasionally, they're even reimagined in new and fresh ways. If we're looking at Carrie White as an example, much of the same traits and characteristics can be seen in 2002's May. The titular outcast is clearly indebted to King's work in numerous ways, but she manages to stand outside of Carrie's shadow in that her own story is told with the same empathy and honesty that made Carrie's tale stick with us in the first place. By the same metric, Jason Voorhees possesses shades of Frankenstein's monster. Hulking, misunderstood monsters who lash out against a world that rejects and despises them. In all facets of storytelling, be it the play, the novel, poetry, echoes of the past bubble up to the surface. History largely comes in cycles. The legacy of the horror movie is no different. If these stories didn't strike a chord with people, if they weren't worth remembering or reinventing in the first place, then they would have died and been forgotten a long time ago. They're still here. They're still with us. That's ample proof of their power. I think that the sense and idea of empathy also extends to the sort of individuals who gravitate towards horror, the communities that form around these films. Historically, if you look at the way in which horror fans have been regarded and discussed culturally, there's a very strong and pronounced pattern of demonization. The horror fan represented as unusual or strange or potentially even dangerous.
Whatever happened to playing with dolls and dreaming of Prince Charming? Chrissy Pollard reporting from Portsmouth. Liam Sanford has probably seen more video nasties than anyone else in the country. He reviews them for Video Viewer, and what's more, he thinks they're misunderstood. I mean, you seem a normal enough fellow. Why do you watch them?
The fervour has died off somewhat in the modern day, especially with the gradual acceptance of horror into the mainstream. But looking back at news stories and articles dating back 40 or even 30 years ago is incredibly bracing. In regards to horror cinema in general, the press didn't really know shit about horror movies, but in the case of its fans, they were especially misinformed. The horror community are, by and large, some of the nicest and most genuine people you could stand to meet. Some of my closest and best friends are people that I've connected with over a love and shared appreciation for extreme horror. And I'm positive that the majority of people who count themselves as fans of horror movies can likely say the same. The fact that such a passionate and appreciative community is formed around the horror movie in the way that it has is a real testament to its inherent honesty and empathy as a genre. Although I know people who are incredibly passionate about action cinema or war movies, hell, so am I, there's not quite a strong sense of there being a shared community around those types of movies in the way that it is for horror. And if we continue to dig back further and further into the past, there's a great deal more we can uncover about the genre's special qualities and characteristics, and how the power of the horror film managed to unite a community in reasonably desperate times for the genre. So, let's take a step back in time for a moment, back to Britain in the 1980s. If you're at all familiar with the video nasty scandal that took place in Britain in the early 1980s, there's a great documentary I would recommend watching entitled Video Nasty's Moral Panic, Censorship and Videotape if you're not. You remember that after the cultural uproar against perceived violence and depravity in what was considered to be a new and more extreme breed of horror cinema, the government passed a hasty law that tightened the ropes on what could and could not be distributed legally. This is actually the law that gave us the BBFC age rating classification on home video releases. What this essentially meant was that all distributors would have to submit their movies to the BBFC in order to ensure a legal release in the UK. If they didn't, it was deemed to be an illegal release and liable to be seized by the police. This isn't too dissimilar from the classification system that continues to exist in Britain in the modern day, with one glaring and notable exception. The BBFC had far more conservative standards regarding what could and could not be deemed acceptable for home release. And as a result, many of the horror movies that were being resubmitted for legal distribution were being cut to ribbons, or were simply not being allowed legal distribution at all.
Whenever you rent or buy a video, you need to be sure that the film you choose is suitable for the audience at home. To help you, there are certificates given to films which tell you broadly what the film is like. This film has been classified 18, which means it's for adults only. It's an offence for your shop to supply an 18 video to anyone under that age, so don't ask them to break the law. An 18 film will certainly have an adult theme and might well contain strong scenes of sex or violence, which could be quite graphic. It may also contain some very explicit language, which will frequently mean sexual swear words. The video certificates are there to give you the chance to make an informed choice. They allow you to have peace of mind and be entertained.
A great example of how problematic and intrusive some of these cuts could actually be comes from my own personal experience. I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, this video is probably going to be long enough as it is, but I think that my anecdote does have particular relevance in illuminating the standards and practices of the BBFC during this period. In the UK, for a long time, these heavily cut releases were the only legal way in which you'd be able to experience the vast majority of these films. And to my knowledge, this one still cannot be experienced fully uncut. As a result, I found myself watching the trimmed version of a film called Eaten Alive, an Italian cannibal exploitation flick that was made in the aftermath of Diodaro's cannibal holocaust, and it's a monolithic success across the world. It's a poorly paced but reasonably entertaining slice of European exploitation. You could certainly do a lot worse. And for the majority of the runtime, I didn't really notice anything out of the ordinary. And then I reached the ending. There's a brief scene in which the protagonists are pursued by cannibals, which results in a smash cut back to a hospital room situated in New York City. No context, no explanation of how they escaped their unfortunate fate. The credits rolled, and I quickly took to Google to find out what exactly I'd missed. Turns out, quite a lot.
It's horrible. I can't understand the reason for such cruelty.
What this unreasonably lengthy tangent is meant to tell you is that the BBFC basically did not give two shits about what they were cutting and the state the film would be left in through that process. And I saw it before my own eyes. A perfectly watchable and entertaining, if unremarkable film, reduced to an incomprehensible mess by the time the credits rolled. And, as I say, these films were arguably the lucky ones. There were plenty of other horror movies that were simply not allowed release. Admittedly, horror films were not the only targets on the BBFC's radar. The vigilante classic Death Wish was another victim that remained banned in this country almost until the turn of the millennium. But horror was being hit the hardest, and the most unfairly. But it seems we're in a little bit of danger from getting away from my main point here. How does this relate to the horror fans? How does this relate to the unique power and honesty that appeals so strongly to such a passionate group of people? Well, the horror community presented proof of that passion and enthusiasm for the genre that had stolen their hearts, with the manner in which they reacted to the systematic stamping out of horror cinema in Britain. Firstly, the underground tape trading market began to flourish. Of course, there had always been a market for pirated videos. Tape trading with friends, relatives, and even through the post was just part and parcel of home video, and happened frequently even outside of the horror community. But, like with Prohibition in 1920s America, the banning and restrictions imposed on horror cinema drove fans to the underground, and ensured that the illegal tape trading market gained more prominence and notoriety as a result. It was the only way to see most of these movies, after all. If you were serious about horror, or wanted to be, you had little choice. And again, it was not nearly as seedy or as strange as the press made it sound during this period.
Well, the foregoing, of course, referred to the most popular legitimately rented videos. God knows what the list of the top 10 pirate videos looks like, but it probably includes Reservoir Dogs and Natural Born Killers and various other movies not yet available on tape to honest customers. You obviously would never buy a pirated video, would you? Well, actually, one or two of you look as if you might. And
My advice to the public is this. If you have any moral sense at all or duty to children, you do not buy pirate tapes. You are funding drugs. You are funding counterfeit money. You're funding organised crime.
Bagged up and ready for presentation in court, some of the drugs seized in Hull. In another corner, some of the explicit and illegal videos.
You have a video and that can be copied no end of times, although the quality does go down somewhat, but you've still got that very saleable commodity.
Despite the efforts of customs officers, it is inevitable that smuggled goods do get through. Once in this country, the video nasties are copied and sold. It's now down to trading standards officials to investigate this seedy business.
On the whole, it was largely just passionate fans coming together and sharing the things that they loved with each other. Whether it being tape trading with their friends, meeting people through video stores, or attending specialised conventions. But, of course, it became intensely difficult for fans to come across certain movies, even ones that were doing the rounds in the pre-certification days. And that's to say nothing of films that came out following those imposed restrictions. So, how did the more determined horror fans get a hold of those rarer and more elusive titles, when the tape trading market had come up short and there was nowhere else to turn? The answer? VHS smuggling. Yes, you heard me correctly. Smuggling VHS copies of movies across international borders, taking up time, money, not to mention the legal implications if they happened to be caught. These smugglers ran the risk of incurring fines if they were lucky. If not, their houses could be raided, they could face a court hearing, and they might have even been looking at jail time. It is, no matter which way you slice it, insane to me the length these individuals went in order to bring horror back to Britain. And I love it and admire it deeply. As such, as both proof of my admiration and because it's genuinely very interesting, I'm going to lay out exactly how they accomplished all this. Usually they'd take a flight to a European country, where the censorship restrictions were far more relaxed, and shop around for some tapes that they wanted to take back. Now, it wasn't simply a matter of burying the VHS tapes in luggage and hoping that customs wouldn't search for them. Some individuals decided to simply replace the case of the original film with a title that is less likely to cause alarm if it was found. But of course, sometimes the tapes were played just to ensure that it actually was the film advertised on the case. So the trick became to disassemble the VHS tape, open up the outer case and remove the spool of videotape inside. This could be very easily and safely stored inside a pocket or hidden away in luggage.
And people are fairly crafty in the ways that they try and bring it into the country. The simple fact that they can just take it and have it on the spool as opposed to the video cassette itself. So, there's all sorts of ways and means. And to take it down from a video cassette to a spool, and you can hide that virtually anywhere.
Of course, these smugglers were a distinct minority amongst the horror community. These were only the most dedicated, hardcore fans. But the fact that they even existed at all is nothing short of astounding. Now, I don't mean to relay all this information to suggest that being a horror fan in the 80s and 90s was a better or more interesting experience than it is to be one now. Without exaggeration, those were very dark times for anyone who had even the slightest interest in extreme occult cinema. I mean, very fortunate as someone who has largely grown up in the age of the internet, given the almost instant availability to the vast majority of films. And even being very much aware of that, it is sometimes easy to take for granted, and worth reminding ourselves of the not-so-distant past. But I bring all this up because I think it stands as a genuine testament to the passion and enthusiasm horror fans demonstrated for that genre, an experience that they couldn't really find anywhere else. Horror resonated with these people in such a way that they kept it alive even in the face of losing their money, their reputation, and sometimes their freedom. And as I've been reiterating throughout this video, it is only something as special and as honest as horror that could drive people to do that. But horror has always been the underdog, hasn't it? The outsider, the loner, difficult to love, difficult to understand. I think that is part of the reason why we inevitably feel such an affinity with these movies. They speak to the part of us that feels alienated and alone, the feelings within us that are messy and confusing and hard to come to terms with. And again, I don't think I'm alone in admitting that. Cinema as a medium is particularly interesting because it can evoke such a wide range of personal and individual responses, but there's a universality that is particular to it. It's largely a medium that we consume with other people, Whether that's going out to the cinemas, university screenings, drunken nights in, watching cinematic dumpster fires.
Michael and I are going to indulge in an all-night orgy of sex and violence.
What, in the drawing room?
Yeah. First, we're going to have sex with the headless corpse of the Virgin astronaut.
Won't the carpet get awfully sticky?
It's a video nasty!
And it's especially one that we examine and discuss as a community, something that has been furthered by the advent of the internet. Even aside from social media apps like Letterboxd that are designed around this communal engagement with a discussion of film, sites like YouTube, like this video you're watching right just now, help to facilitate and broaden that discussion. Which is why I think horror is equally fascinating and special as a genre of film, because it provokes such a wide array of very visceral and personal reactions. Everything from revulsion and shock to empathy and understanding, and yet those who it deeply resonates with are united together through that affection in such a pronounced way. I think, to further my point, I'll use a film that provokes a very personal and emotional response from me. Nightmare on Elm Street 3: Dream Warriors. If you are at all familiar with this channel, you'll remember that I've actually covered this movie before, in a video that I'm not wholly pleased with. Admittedly, that video does seem a little juvenile and overwritten looking back at it now. Even then, I think my issues with it lie in the fact that it was something I created when the channel was in its infancy, and as such it's a little rough around the edges. I imagine that I might be able to make a better job of that video today. Regardless, I believe that in spite of those issues, it stands as a testament to how special and important that film is to me. Dream Warriors uses these very confronting and challenging issues of things like mental illness, addiction, and trauma as part of its horror, but provides insight and care in the way that it approaches those issues. Because really, it's a film all about facing your demons, attempting to stand up and fight even when the odds are insurmountable. To not let the issues and problems that shackle you define your life and who you are as an individual. It's a message that's simple, yeah, but it's a very important one, I think. And the manner in which that story is told and those issues are explored is nothing short of sincere. There's a genuine empathy that this film demonstrates towards these characters. Their victories are met with the appropriate fanfare and reverence. Their losses are met with these uneasy moments of silence. The film isn't above responding to or caring about these characters, and as a result it's much easier to develop an attachment to the Dream Warriors in such a striking and clear way. I love all the original Nightmare movies, from the palpable darkness of New Nightmare to the unrestrained insanity of Freddy's Dead, but I don't think there's a cast in these movies that have resonated with me as strongly as the Dream Warriors do. And given that it's one of the series' most popular and well-regarded entries, sometimes beating out the universally revered original, I think that the feeling is widespread. Ironically, to bring this all back around to my original point, I find that Roger Ebert probably manages to summarise my argument incredibly well. And I call this ironic given that I'm not entirely sure how he'd feel about that, given that he was notoriously dismissive of the vast majority of horror cinema, especially in its extremities. But nonetheless, his words are very applicable here. He famously defined cinema as an empathy machine, through its capacity for it to allow us to step into the shoes and empathise with individuals that we wouldn't normally be able to in the real world. I believe this to be true, but I personally go a little bit further and say that horror is special as a genre primarily because it is the purest, most fundamental distillation of that empathy machine, given that it stretches the very limits of the people we can begin to empathise with in a manner not allowed by other genres and styles, and does so with a sincerity and an honesty that is so important to the effectiveness of that feeling of empathy. That's not to pretend that every horror film is crafted with the same care and attention as some of the very best in the genre. Some horror films do demonise mental illness, or feature violence as any spectacle, or have their underlying meanings muddied by poor scripts or performances. The genre isn't always perfect, but when it gets that empathy and that honesty spot on, it's an experience that is special, oddly life-affirming, like nothing else out there. And I suppose to a lot of people this all might sound a bit obvious, but even if it's an obvious point, I think it's well worth repeating. That's why horror will save you. It may be ugly and crude and in outrageously bad taste, but it's real. It's honest. It'll be there for you. All hail.
Hail Satan! Hail Satan! Tonight, hail Satan! Hail, hail!
Hello. If you have made it this far, thank you for watching. Believe it or not, this actually started life as one of my shortest videos. There's a finished version that's about 6 minutes long that I had originally planned to publish before realising that I could expand on what I wanted to say and really dig deep into a topic that I'm very passionate about. It may well have gotten out of hand at some point, but it's not for me to say. The stories tend to grow in the telling, after all. If you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you could like or subscribe. It really does help me out, and creating something of this size and complexity was intensely challenging for me. Although I can't pretend I didn't enjoy it.